All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture, which is part of the Hyde lecture series hosted by the College of Architecture. I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Joseph Altshuler. Before I do introduce Joseph, I want to remind you that we'll have a short question and answer session immediately following the lecture, so please stick around for that as well. Joseph Altshuler is assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is also co-founder, along with Zach Morrison, of Could Be Design, a design practice that imagines the built environment as an animate being with an agency of its own. From exuberant interiors to interactive public spaces, Could Be Design positions architecture as an active character in the world, enacting a built environment full of vibrant color, shapely form, and intimate encounters. Could Be Design's work has been exhibited at Miami Art Week, the Milwaukee Art Museum, the Elmhurst Art Museum, and the Detroit Month of Design. In 2023, Could Be Design was named a contributor to the Chicago Architecture Biennial. They were also selected as a University Design Research Fellow at Exhibit Columbus and named one of the 6 winners of the 2023 Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers awarded by the Architectural League of New York. Altshuler's first book, Creatures Are Stirring, A Guide to Architectural Companionship, prompts readers to befriend architectural companions through a collection of essays, flash fictions, and case studies that illustrate solidarity amongst humans, non-humans, buildings, and the broader environment. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joseph Altshuler.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thank you so much to your whole community for inviting me and welcoming me to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. This is my first day of my life in Nebraska, and it's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed meeting some students over lunch and in reviews this afternoon in studio. So thanks for having me. I'm going to chat a little bit today about what I like to call public displays of affection, which we of course know about public displays of affection among humans, which some of you may have strong feelings about. But I also want to think about public displays of affection as something that's part of an architectural conversation. And I think there's maybe 3 types of relationships that I'm really interested in my work and that I'm going to talk about today in different ways. There's, of course, the human-to-human relationship. But there's also a human-to-architecture relationship. And there's also an architecture-to-architecture relationship. And through my work, and I should say that everything I show today is the result of collaborations of many kinds, but especially in particular with my partner in practice, whose name is Zach Morrison, and very often there's many other collaborators as well, which I'll attempt to attribute as I can. But in our work, we're particularly interested in this third and let's say slightly weirder vector of relationships. That is to say, what does it mean for architecture to express affection for other architecture? What does it mean for architecture to be a character in the world that has a kind of liveliness and life akin to the ways that we form friendships and relationships with our fellow humans? And where do humans fall within that framework? And how can we participate in that kind of world? That may sound a little weird, but I'm going to try to show you some really tangible projects from our practice that try to tease out some of these themes and to imagine a world that's actually abounding with relationships of many kinds. And in the process, I know your lecture series is trajectories. I'd like to also kind of suggest some ways that architectural education and a kind of architectural training might play out in maybe slightly untraditional ways in the world beyond the design of buildings. But to think about architecture as a much broader world-building endeavor, and an endeavor that I think, particularly in the world right now as I see it, could benefit from some more affection, could benefit from some more love, and could benefit from a more expanded tool set of interaction, of intimacy, and of immersion. So when I was an architecture student, when I started undergrad 22 years ago, I sat in a lecture hall, kind of like this one, on the first day of school, and they put a slide that looked kind of like this. You've probably seen slides like this, maybe not in the exact color or typeface, but same content, right? That architecture from this Western Vitruvian standpoint has 3 vectors, 3 attributes, three criteria: firmness, utility, and delight. This is nothing new, and this is how architecture school started for me. And I'm like, I don't know what some of those words are, but OK, we'll see what happens. And actually, I think in the case of my lecture, these were actually in Latin, not in English. So I was even more confused. And I want to offer that, while on one hand, I think architecture is many more things than these three, I want to kind of challenge and consider how firmness, architecture structure, what makes it have definition and clarity, its utility, the programs and activities and interactions that it makes possible, and perhaps most importantly, in this moment in time, its delight, the joy, the pleasures, and the deep sense of enjoyment that's possible in the built environment, that these are, in fact, things that we can challenge with new language, that these are attributes that we can offer through a new lens. I like alliteration, so I chose three words that started with I to be a kind of framework for our trajectory today. So firmness becomes inhabitation. It becomes thinking about how architecture, whether as an object, as an environment, as a public realm, is something that we can truly inhabit and occupy, that we can have nested relationships and find new ways of being inside of. That architecture can be more interactive, that we can actually, let's say in place of utility, can find ways of actually participating in the built environment through an expanded sense of our senses, and that finally that delight becomes intimacy, that we can have a kind of encounter with the world, with the built environment, and with each other, that can bring a closeness of proximity that I think our world lacks right now. And that even in a public space, I think so often we think about intimacy as something that happens in our private domestic spaces. But what does it mean to be intimate in public? These are some of the questions that I'm going to ask today and show through some of my projects, and that might sort of set a framework or a trajectory around public displays of affection. And there are kind of four buckets of sort of strategies that we're going to look at today that will intersect with some of those ideas. Again, I like alliteration, so we'll see a few alliterative category names. And we'll get right into it. So we're going to start with intimate inglenooks. Intimacy, I think, in architecture, and especially when it comes to challenging the possibilities for intimacy in public. That is, when do we feel close to one another in public? When do we feel close to our community? When do we feel close to our building? Is it possible to hug architecture? Is it possible for architecture to hug us back? This is a question about intimacy, and it's through inglenooks, the small little spaces that are scaled to our bodies, that I've found a kind of opportunity to experiment with in my practice. So jumping into a project, this is McCormick After Party. This is a project for an interior architecture installation in this building. Maybe quick audience participation. Who is the architect of this building? Yes.
I'll take Frank Lloyd Wright, 500.
I'm afraid you just lost $500. No, it's not Frank Lloyd Wright. A modernist figure. If we were in Chicago, maybe I know some of you took a field trip to Chicago recently, you would see buildings by this architect everywhere. Who's this architect? Yeah. Yes, this is Mies van der Rohe. And so you probably are more familiar with a slightly more famous house that looks kind of like this, if you are familiar with Mies van der Rohe, which is the Farnsworth house, which is, a house that architects love to drool over and is maybe about an hour outside of Chicago. And Mies van der Rohe only designed there are only three single-family homes designed by Mies van der Rohe that are built in America. This is one of the three, and I would say is the slightly less famous younger sister of the Farnsworth house. And for anyone who's familiar with the Farnsworth house, you may know that it had a rather tumultuous relationship with its owner and client, Dr. Edith Farnsworth, we won't go into that right now, but suffice it to say, as a quick summary, there was a complicated relationship between Dr. Edith Farnsworth and the house, and the house did not, in a variety of ways, always serve her comfort and life in the way that it could have. And one of the things I've always been interested in this house, this sort of less famous younger sister of the Farnsworth house, is it was a house, let's say, equally part of Mies van der Rohe's modernist ethos and his obsession with kind of steel and glass construction. But unlike the Farnsworth house, which had no interior, really, aside from the bathroom, no really interior walls or partitions, this house was much more subdivided and partitioned into different rooms in a slightly more, at least as far as mid-century modernism goes, a slightly more traditional way. That I believe was actually part of making it a much more loved home by its occupants, which was a family that had kids. And the house is divided into these kind of two lobes that come together at this very narrow point. And one half of the house is really for the children, and one half is for the adults. There was maybe some very hierarchical domestic thinking about the relationship between parents and kids that went into this design. But it was loved by a family for many years. And I really think that counterintuitively to, let's say, a typical Mies van der Rohe building that you might find, it's because of the kind of floor-to-ceiling walls that you find. Now, this home was purchased by a museum in the 90s, and the first thing the museum did is they tore out most of the walls to make it into a gallery. In my opinion, kind of the very thing that lent its interior to have a kind of functional and intimate quality for its family. My practice was invited to do an installation in this home. And so our approach was kind of looking at the overlay of kind of Mies van der Rohe's original plan and the kind of new floor plan that removed many of the walls. And our ambition was to reenact and reinscribe some of the partitions that had been removed and that contributed to creating specific identities for the programs of domestic life. And we did this, of course, this is a historic building, so we weren't allowed to build any walls or drill any permanent holes or alterations to the home. And so we suspended these sort of large format curtains to reinscribe the locations of where walls were originally in the home. And we also created a series of custom furnishings, let's say, that's the things that you see in Mint, that while they don't look anything like the original furniture that was in this mid-century modern home, start to reenact the program or start to reenact the behaviors that might have taken place there. And in so doing, to invite people to re-inhabit this home and to experience some of the intimate inglenooks that it maybe once offered, albeit with a very different aesthetic and sort of programmatic flair. So each one of these furnishings has a kind of specifically points to an original program. So a spot to sit in the original living room. And in all of these, there's also, because they're curtains, which is a nod to Mies van der Rohe's longtime collaborator, Lily Reich, there's an opportunity to kind of poke through and to straddle the identity of different rooms in the home, to eavesdrop, to play chess with your partner in what was originally the parlor of the home. We reenacted a kind of galley kitchen in the original location of the kitchen counter, where the fixtures were filled with candy, a puppet theater in the children's playroom that sort of brought that room to life, and even beds in the bedrooms where visitors to this installation could lie down to actually take a rest or to have an intimate moment with a companion in public in this space. And part of our ambition for this was to think about even historic preservation in the context of this important Mies van der Rohe home, not as something that we cordon off. And typically when you visit this home, if anyone gets a chance to visit this, it's just outside Chicago. You have to wear booties and you can't touch anything, and it's very precious. And we wanted to think about how the attributes of architecture, the attributes of affection could actually make visiting a historic place something that's interactive, something that's immersive, something where you can lie down on a bed and touch things and feel like you are inhabiting and being part of space. Again, not in any ways to say recreate what this might have looked like at a historic period, as some historic preservation is interested in. I'd like to think that Mies van der Rohe would be rolling in his grave if he saw the sort of color and, let's say, visual vocabulary that we were bringing to this installation, but rather that there's something about how it operates, how it behaves, how it is a kind of companion to us. This idea of intimacy and inglenooks is something we've explored through a lot of other interior architecture-oriented installations. We did a project called Make an Anthropocene. It was a project that was kind of inspired by the history of dioramas. It was a project that was in essentially a display case in an architecture school in Chicago at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And the space is 40 feet wide, 6 feet tall, and like 2 feet deep. And it's essentially a glorified display, a very wide, long display case that the school would typically use for students and faculty to hang up drawings or to just like place models on its shelf. But when we were invited to do an installation and like sort of think about its dioramic qualities, we were really interested in how we could actually invite community members of the school to enter and inhabit this strange shelf. Essentially to become part of a living diorama, to have a kind of specific inhabitation of this space, that it's not just something to look at, but something to inhabit. And the result was something like this. And we took, let's say, doodles from our sketchbook and thought about how those doodles could become three-dimensional by essentially kind of bending and undulating this framework throughout the space. These forms are meant to evoke, in an open-ended way, a kind of animate, creaturely quality. Some of them have legs, appendages, heads. They're not meant to replicate any known animal species, but they're meant to evoke the qualities of animation that we often ascribe to the broader animal kingdom. And to think about how the abstraction of architectural form can instantiate that sense of life in the space. In the same spirit that like when you see a diorama in a natural history museum, and there's a kind of three-dimensional taxidermy animal that's placed into a scenic backdrop, it creates the sensibility of a whole world, even in a very shallow space. But we wanted to make that something that was open-ended enough that people could inhabit and make their own. And because this is in a hallway, as you approach it from different angles, you rarely see it frontally in the way I showed you in the previous slide, but you're usually approaching it from a kind of diagonal angle. And so the undulation or the bending of the forms snap into and out of optical perception as you walk by. So every time you walk by, you might see a slightly different shape or figure or creature that might sort of snap into perception. And this was a temporary installation. It was there for about a semester, but during its run, it became a focal point of the school. It became a place where people would sit and hang out in these little pockets of sort of lingering, of inhabiting. And this is not a soft, plushy, stuffed animal, but moments like this where I would say you're almost cuddling with the architecture. This is kind of what I'm after, and is for me a kind of sign of success that somebody would be inspired to even entangle themselves into this sort of strange world. So in our practice, we do a lot of these installations, but we also do, let's say, more client-driven commissions as well. We used to do more kind of residential work. Now we're doing kind of more public space-oriented work. But we try to bring these same attributes that like in some ways are very intuitive to bring to an art installation context, also into the context of client commission practice. So for an example, this is a residential project. And this is interiors focused. It was a gut rehab project. So this is actually so maybe a little washed out on the screen, but this is the demo plan of the project. I always like demo plans, the plans that show you what you're removing from a project. And is this very funny trapezoid-shaped building. For anyone, this is in Chicago, where my practice is based. And for anyone who knows Chicago, this is a very unusual lot size and aspect ratio for Chicago, and probably for many cities. Typical Chicago lots are 25 feet wide and 125 feet deep, these kind of long, slender rectangles. But there's this one part of the city where there's a shipping canal that sort of cuts through the city on a diagonal, heading southwest. And that disrupts the otherwise like super rigid and oppressive rectilinear grid of the city and creates in certain neighborhoods these weird lots where the diagonal of this trapezoid is just reacting to the fact that there's this diagonal shipping canal that's disrupting the sort of neighborhood grid. And the result is we had this 2-unit residential building that had all these weird angles and walls. Like when we went into the existing building, I got a little nauseous because all the walls were at kind of funny angles, and I mean, super interesting, but like weird geometry, and frankly, a lot of weird dead spaces that for a square footage as small as this are really hard to utilize. So our gut rehab kind of reimagines that. This is a two-unit building. One is owner occupied, and the other, the unit that's on top in this plan and that sort of encapsulates some of the funny angles, is a artist residency residential unit. The owner is a curator and arts organizer, and she welcomes visiting artists to use this space on a seasonal basis. So it's sort of a rotating resident. And the objective was to use this not only as like a very, very small housing. These are very small units. These are like about 400 to 500 square feet each. But that even in this sort of intimate, small residence, that the artist could invite the public into the space for talks, for small gallery shows, for demos, and for gatherings. And so our challenge was, how do you make such a weird square footage, such a weird, both small square footage and weird geometry? How do you make that useful and practical? And what we quickly kind of figured out is that like any kind of standard furniture didn't play well in some of these funny shapes. And with such a small footprint, we turned to a lot of kind of built-in furnishings and built-in millwork as a way of kind of navigating between these funny angles and making the space more inhabitable for groups that would actually enter the home in different ways. So this is the main living space, which has this kind of tiered seating for talks, but also for storage. You can see this lived in by one of the artists. And we vaulted the ceiling a little bit and kind of struck this color datum line. And so this space doubles as a gallery where artists can kind of put their visual work up on this sort of art ledge. And that kind of ties through the space in different ways. Looking back towards the sort of narrow point of the trapezoid and the entry. And lots of things in the house have to kind of do double duty because of the square footage. Like for instance, in the study, we kind of designed a custom desk that could flip in and out to accommodate either actually a working space or making it more of a social space around the library. The kitchen doubles as a kind of a cooking demo space around the kitchen island. And sort of at every turn, we use kind of an interest in color and aperture that maybe you saw in some of the previous projects to create these kind of really specific connections where it's not just an open plan, but there's these kind of deliberate apertures that kind of connect you to different parts of the house. And that, like, we hope in the process kind of punch this, let's say, cartoon-shaped hole into the fabric of everyday life to remind us that like everything we do in architecture is an act of the imagination and not just a kind of inevitable functional result. We didn't do much with the exterior. This sort of weird stone facade was existing, but through some small graphic and landscape-oriented sort of moves, sort of reimagined its relationship to the street, including like rewilding the parkway between the sidewalk and the street, and sort of perching this little companion, this little free seed library, in the spirit of the ubiquitous little free book library, as a kind of offering to the neighborhood where you can get native seeds and rewild your own parkway, and ultimately became a kind of focal point of other kind of sidewalk activities around this residence. All right, so that brings us to the second bucket or the second design strategy I wanted to chat about today. This is haptic happenings. And this is really about doubling down on how program and the activation of our senses, the full gradation of human senses, can play a more active role in how we make design decisions and how we imagine the ways that people can interact with built things. So one example of this is a project we did recently. It was an exhibition design project at the Chicago Architecture Center. The Chicago Architecture Center is just kind of this architecture museum in downtown Chicago that also organizes the boat tours that maybe some of you have gone on. And they maintain a kind of active museum gallery space. And we were hired to design their most recent exhibit, which was about kind of reimagining central business districts in downtown areas in the post-COVID era. And reimagine some sort of adaptive reuse scenarios in the face of a lot of commercial vacancy. Our approach, though, was to think about this exhibit not just as like a way of displaying renderings or information about these adaptive reuse projects, but to really think about the space of the exhibit itself as a public forum, as a civic space, where people could both contribute to to the narrative of the exhibit, could respond to the exhibit of the exhibit and dissect and interact with it in different ways. And so the design of the exhibit creates these, we called them follies, but these 4 different kiosks or stations that each connect to a kind of sub-theme of the exhibit and that each offer a unique mode of interaction or feedback back into the curator's content. And while these objects are kind of idiosyncratic and kind of specific to their activities, a floor graphic is like a thing that kind of ties the space together, that encourages a kind of circuitous and non-linear route that you might take as you crisscross around the gallery, and that creates a kind of literal and figural center to an otherwise kind of weird floor plan of the existing building. The graphic is specifically inspired by the kind of graphic treatment that you find in kind of monumental public spaces, such as the Piazza del Campidoglio, from hundreds of years ago, or more recent sort of reinterpretations of such things. And our local vantage point is the James R. Thompson Center, which is one of the most amazing previously public buildings in Chicago, and that has a kind of similar radiating floor pattern directly inspired by some of these plazas. So to make this kind of piazza, this plaza, through the graphic language of this new sort of center of gravity. And the result looked like this. Each of these kind of kiosks or follies offers a specific action, whether it's kind of dissecting the layers of kind of the ecology of downtown, whether it is sitting on a stoop that we created for the exhibit to both reflect and hang out, but also to respond with a survey that and a voting kind of activity about kind of future zoning rules for downtown that was a partnership with the Department of Planning. My favorite of the kiosks is this kind of miniaturized interpretation of the Thompson Center itself, which for many years was the state of Illinois' postmodern public building downtown Chicago, with an incredible, where all the sort of state offices were, but the center atrium was a public space with a food court. And so sort of scaled down at dollhouse scale, it became a kiosk where people could enter into this interpretation of the atrium and vote on how the space might be adaptively reused now that it's owned by Google and being renovated. You can see the sort of voting buckets. And then finally, a periscope that literally connected optically your view down to the river below. I know some of you are doing a studio on the river, so this is just across the street from your studio site. And this is 2 or 3 stories in the air, and so the periscope actually allows you to look down and see the boats and the pedestrians at the level of the riverwalk and the river from a point where it would otherwise be obscured by the buildings surrounding it and the streetscape. So another project in this sort of vein of haptic happenings and really doubling down and thinking about the programmatic activations of spaces is a festival that I established a few years ago in Chicago with a whole host of collaborators and neighborhood partners. The list would be too long to say right now, but I'm going to show you a short video that'll give you a quick kind of taste of this festival. See if this works.
We're setting up for the Chicago Sukkah Design Festival. It happens each fall here in Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood.
Every year, community organizations are paired with designers to design and build a sukkah together.
So what is a sukkah, you ask? Good question. A sukkah is a Hebrew word for booth. Sukkah is an outdoor hut that's used for gathering and socializing, and traditionally they follow a few rules. But these will be a little different. Each of these sukkahs holds a hidden secret. They're designed to come apart, and they can be reconstructed all around the neighborhood for year-round use.
All 9 constructions from the past 2 years are still standing, just somewhere else, as they help people by becoming a farm stand distributing healthy food, or a meditation pavilion for a mental health agency, or an historical marker for youth services.
All of this brings people together in the spirit of the Sukkot holiday, which is really about spending time together and sharing space. Everyone is welcome and everyone has something to share.
This is what it looks like when people come together, and it's intergenerational, it's multicultural, it's just people, human beings, right?
In small projects like this, it shows me the possibilities of what can happen within the large scale things, you know, how anybody can just like pick up a tool and anybody can change a community when we work together.
Introduce yourself to designers, introduce yourself to community organizations, and have some fun.
All right, so pardon some of the cheesiness of promotional videos, but I do want to just like transport us to this place. This is in the North Lawndale neighborhood of Chicago, which is on the west side for anyone who knows the city. And this project has a kind of basic premise and is in some ways a critique of some of the biennial culture and architecture exhibitions that I think have really good intent and that frankly I've participated in many of them, but that I think oftentimes stop short at the ways in which they build longer term relationships with communities. There's a lot of biennials and exhibitions that are these kind of amazing platforms for architects to experiment with form and with material and with fabrication in ways that aren't always possible in conventional practice. But so often, like, architects come in, they make a cool thing, they disappear. It doesn't have, it maybe expands a disciplinary conversation, but it doesn't have real impact on communities. And so I started this festival with a kind of maybe slightly naive ambition that maybe the sort of festival or biennial or pavilion format of architectural experimentation could actually be plugged into a much longer term set of relationships and community building and community development. And so even though we call it a festival, it actually involves a kind of year-round cycle of activities and of partnerships and participation that has become now an annual cycle. We've done this festival 3 times, and maybe for better or for worse, we're planning a 4th right now. But fundamentally, we pair up architects and community organizations who have never heard of each other before. And we don't do that randomly. We do that very carefully and sensitively. But we invite them to co-create an installation together that both can debut to the public as part of our fall festival, but that ultimately has a much more important and higher priority role, which is to serve some kind of program or spatial need that the organization has. And then after so the festival opens to the public, you get to see all the pavilions in one place, there's celebrations. But as soon as the festival closes in November, each of the installations is deinstalled, relocated, and permanently reinstalled at the location of the community organization that co-designed it with an architect. And the first year we did this, we did it with 3 different organizations, 3 different locations. And ever since, we've been sort of expanding the footprint. And now you can like walk around this neighborhood and there's sort of this constellation of sites that radiate around the actual festival grounds where these pavilions have been permanently installed to serve some kind of really specific purpose. And so it's trying to model how, like, let's say the energy and excitement and enthusiasm and fundraising that goes into like putting on this festival actually become a catalyst to feed into a kind of broader network of community development, and that is aligned with the community's quality of life plan that was created before this festival existed. So you can see a little. Most of the photos I have, of course, are like on the actual public-facing part of the festival itself, when all of these pavilions debut together. But afterwards, they get relocated and become less public, but more attuned to a specific purpose. The other piece of this project is actually developing the public space of the festival grounds itself. And incrementally each year, we add a permanent feature to these festival grounds, whether it was sort of seating or this sort of this accessible pathway. More recently, we installed these custom picnic tables that transform the seemingly vacant site of the festival grounds. And this is a neighborhood that has a lot of vacant lots, unfortunately, due to years of systemic racism and redlining. But that we are transforming the site incrementally into a permanent public plaza that supports programming beyond the festival itself. And I won't go into the details of all of these, but like they each serve a purpose, from like being a produce stand for a farmer's market to being a book nook for an after-school program, a meditation pavilion for a trauma-informed mental health agency, a tool library for a lending library of things, a communal table for street vendors. The list goes on. So in the interest of time, though, I'm going to keep going. So the third of the four sort of design strategies I wanted to offer today, I call gregarious graphics. How do graphics in the built environment, how can they be more than information? How can they be more than wayfinding? How can graphics in the built environment that co-participate with more three-dimensional spatial structures, how can they be drivers of identity, drivers of affection, drivers of interaction? When I was in architecture school, I think I kind of like secretly wished I was a graphic designer when I was in architecture school, and I would propose a lot of graphic-oriented things, and like very often I would get this critique like, so superficial. It's not. There's no depth. There's no space. It's just flat, as a critique. And I think I've been like ever since, and I might skip this project just in the interest of time, but ever since I've been, we'll jump into it. I've been trying to like actually make a case for the value of graphics in the built environment. And again, graphics that aren't just about information or like labeling something, but actually that participate in a broader urban structure. This was a very low budget, very modest project in Gary, Indiana, for like a system of new crosswalks throughout the downtown area, and that link not only crosswalks, but also sort of existing bus stops with this kind of graphic wayfinding system. The sort of long story short of this project is the city has no money and failed to get a kind of infrastructure grant that they needed from the Department of Transportation. But they had this like small amount of money that was allocated for public art. So we proposed to them that like, all right, you didn't get the infrastructure budget you needed to do more conventional zebra crosswalks, but maybe we can use this art budget and like think about how public art in the format of asphalt art on the ground can actually sort of serve this infrastructural purpose as well. And we worked with the community to develop this kind of graphic language of, we called them Gary Goyles, but these little creatures that kind of wander away from the steel mill in Gary and that congregate at crosswalks. And again, for me, graphics aren't necessarily purely 2D. Like graphics are about these like supercharged, recognizable forms in the built environment that produce identity, that produce landmarks, that help us situate ourselves and our bodies. And that can take three-dimensional forms as well, as is the case in this project. This is called the Animate Arcade. And this was this kind of family of graphic installations in a university building at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where I teach. This was, I think, in some ways it started as like this classic story. They like built this beautiful new building, pristine and beautiful, light-filled. It was like this, universal open floor plan, and the staff and faculty of this building felt it was like too flexible. They couldn't do the things they wanted because there was no partitions, there was nothing to push back against them. And so we created this series of slightly goofy installations that create both interior landmarks and that start to delineate different parts of programming in this otherwise very open public space, including a welcome desk, a kind of gateway arch and threshold to this, bleacher stair thing that's all the rage these days and you have in your school, and this backdrop for talks, and a roving exhibition kiosk that can be repositioned around the space. And the idea, again, not unlike some of the other work I showed, there is this kind of open-ended animate qualities, like maybe they have eyes, maybe they have apertures, maybe they have outstretched limbs, maybe they don't, maybe it's more abstract. But we hope that like there's like a kind of low fidelity quality that allows people to project their own stories onto them, to name them, to make them part of the everyday life of the school, and to think of them truly as companions along that are of an equal ontological footing as humans that you can form relationships with in this building. And we made this sort of series of videos to introduce them to the community. These are sort of inspired by Sesame Street. And something in our practice is we offer these animations as a way of trying to make our stories come alive in different ways. This one got a little weird though, a little kinky. We made a series of these, so if you're interested in these, I can send you to more, but I won't bother you with more of them now. Graphics, of course, also like take place in some of our more commercial-oriented practice. I'm not going to go into super detail here, but this was a design for a brewery, and it was like one of these big cavernous spaces that the acoustics were terrible, and it was like really big and open, and there was a very low-budget project, so we turned to graphics again as a way of making specific and characterful spaces, but also spaces that helped orient you and direct you as sort of part of an integral part of the design. You can see this is the sort of in-progress stenciling we did right onto the floor. Lots of tape, but the result was something like this. And so the space is broken down into these different zones that are all correspond to a different graphic that also kind of lead you around the space, and that produce these kind of little zones, and some of which where the graphic kind of gets extruded and becomes 3D. This was an acoustic felt canopy that hovered over the stage for open mic nights, and that also created this banquette to actually have a conversation, so you'd actually hear the person you're having a conversation with in a space that was otherwise sort of cavernous and impossible. I'm going to go really quickly through it, though. All right, so the fourth and final design strategy, because I want to leave time for questions, is what we call lively locomotion. So whether we're paying attention or not, architecture is always moving. Whether it's as simple as doors and windows opening, whether it's the subtle movements that you can't perceive of live loads and dead loads interacting, whether it's the air blowing through the ductwork and exhaust being emitted outside. Like, buildings are living, breathing, moving. Let's say a conventional Western worldview of architecture and its value would like us to believe that the stationary, the fixed, the permanent is an ideal, a virtue. And certainly when it comes to structure, it often is. A moving building is not a structural engineer's friend. But I think in many of our projects, we're interested in if we allow ourselves, either conceptually or literally, to untether our architecture from its fixity, from its fixed foundations, that there is a whole world of relationships and new vantage points that are possible. And I think a really palpable reminder that architecture is alive. One of the things I think that we often qualify, like in a biology textbook, but even just in our imagination, if something's alive, it's moving. If something's not moving, it's dead. And of course, we know that's not always true. But I think the more that in our practice we try to exaggerate the ways that architecture moves as an exaggeration and a way of like unlearning this idea that architecture is dead, that in fact architecture is alive and possible to be our friend. And early on in our practice, we loved animated GIFs and GIFs, and we made this series of seesaws for a digital architecture publication that try to amplify some kind of character quality. This was, we had names for these. This was Peekaboo Priscilla, where as you're kind of seesawing into these little masks, you alternately see or don't see your partner. Good for on-again, off-again relationships. This is Sideways Seymour. This is a seesaw for introverts. You don't even need to have a human partner to interact and have a relationship with this architecture, though you do need some careful, precise tushy wiggles. This is Rebound Rodney. This is a seesaw for multitaskers, where you can practice your hoop game and seesaw at the same time. And then finally, this is Thermal Thelma. This is part seesaw, part hot tub, or as I like to say, a sea spa, where swimsuits are optional. But in many ways, I think, and I threw this in, I wasn't going to show this, but I was talking to some students at lunch. Like, I think my challenge to you as architecture students, as practitioners, is to think about how our models and our drawings can actually be scenography or stage sets for short performances or films or animations. That like time we know. a slightly goofy project, but like I think it's emblematic of like a kind of practice that we're interested in, and that we are now like trying to like really test out in the world. So this is the last project I'll show today. This is the carousel for companionship, which is our kind of really our first proof of concept of a truly kind of kinetic architecture. This was an installation for a public space in Columbus, Indiana. It most certainly borrows from a merry-go-round that you might find in a playground, but this is emphatically not a merry-go-round. It's not. It's playful in its language, but it's not meant to be specifically or exclusively a play structure. But rather, it's meant to be a kind of social infrastructure, a kind of platform for making everyday life more interactive, more alive and lively. And I won't go into its whole story. It borrows from all of its forms are borrowed from different landmarks around Columbus, Indiana, which is filled with mid-century modern architecture. It has a relationship to a street that is sometimes closed to pedestrians. This was the site. We had to like pick our own site for this project, which is the most impossible thing to do. But this is the site we chose, which is this weird, kind of decrepit back of house space. But what I love about the site is it's like this. It's like these children's books where it's like how many shapes are in this picture. It's like it's all painted beige as if to disappear, but it has triangular soffits and circular rounded corners and cascading parapets and diagrid pavers. And so our goal is to make all those shapes that were sleeping come alive and to use the rotating platform as a kind of viewing device where like as you rotate it and through its apertures, different parts of it snap into and out of perception as you rotate it. And then it becomes a kind of visual game that everyone can play. And that also, as you start rotating it, you get these funny, like sort of visual rhymes and alignments with the landmarks that it's referencing. This kind of device for the city. And it was something that required participation. It's not a playground equipment, so you can't easily spin it out of control. It actually requires more than one person to really get it moving and to change its rotation. And so it induces a kind of cooperation in the process where you can't really get it moving by yourself, but you have to maybe talk to a stranger or a companion to make it fully come to life. So the very last thing I want to say before we open up to questions, I have like a minute left, is all of these ideas, all of these ambitions are things that I've tried to unpack and tried to also kind of create a lineage and also a future of in architecture through this book, Creatures Are Stirring, A Guide to Architectural Companionship. This book traces a history in architecture of buildings that look like or behave like animate creatures. And we use the word animate creature as an intentionally wide net to include both buildings that are like literally replicating an animal, but also buildings and architectures that are more open-ended and that start to, again, have these animate qualities without being so like on the nose or high fidelity in their replication or reenactment of a creaturely being from outside of architecture. So the book is filled with images and diagrams and drawings and probably overly complicated diagrams like this that try to sort out the different qualities of resemblance, of behavior, and of relationships that architecture can take on if we suspend our disbelief and like imagine that the world could be filled with creatures and not just buildings that look like buildings. And the purpose of this book is not to say that all buildings should look like animals. I definitely don't think that. The purpose of this book is to say that if we allow ourselves to think about buildings in a more open-ended, creaturely way, that we can unlearn this idea that buildings are just here to put a roof over our head and serve our needs, that buildings can actually participate in this kind of animation of life. Whether they look like an animal or not, I don't really care. But I think it's a kind of useful case study to think about the history and future of buildings that look like or resemble creatures, to think about these things and to imagine alternative futures. So the book includes these sort of memoirs that are written from buildings and architecture's points of view in the first person, from the past, from the present, and the future. This is the past, where the caves are talking to us, or the present, when my friend the Sears Tower in Chicago is talking to us during a rainstorm in May of 2020, when the two-flat that I was living in has a story to tell, and when sort of future architectures that are yet to be defined also have stories to tell about an interrelationship between humans, between animals, between biotic and abiotic beings, and that ultimately creates this kind of fictional universe of a world, and like this is a 12-foot long drawing that I made that doesn't fit very well on a screen. Excited for your question. I have copies of the book that are available for purchase. I will sign those personally to you if you're so inclined. And I'm super happy to take questions.
Thanks, Joseph, for a fantastic lecture. We do have time for a few questions.
Great. Yes.
You have some amazing animations throughout this process here, and I'm just curious if you have any advice for us as young designers on how we can start kind of getting our feet in the door in terms of creating our own animations in order to further enhance our own architectural designs.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Great question. I mean, I think the short answer is, and I'm happy to follow up with a longer answer, is you're already making amazing drawings. You're already making amazing models. Those models and those drawings don't need to be fixed. They don't need to be stationary. And in fact, I think they're already setups or stage sets, if you will, for a story that might have a temporal or moving image aspect. So the way to get into it is to take the drawings you've already made, you've already exist, find your favorite project you've already made, and get the best drawing from that project that has the most details, and imagine, in a stop motion sense, how there could be 100 frames of that same drawing, where in every frame something is incrementally a little different. And that's a drawing practice. You don't have to be a filmmaker. You don't have to be a cinematographer. I'm not. I'm teaching myself these things. My animations are not fancy. They're not sleek. And they're not about like a fly through, like some of our new rendering softwares allow us to just like fly through. And there's no real story. It's just like a camera moving. But rather, there's something intentional and narrative and specific to something about the identity of your project that can be incrementally changed to demonstrate how something changes over time. And you can do that with any section drawing, any plan drawing, any perspective drawing, and any physical model. So stop motion, a series of stills. We make stills every day. Let's stream them together and make them tell time-based stories.
Another question?
Yeah, up here.
I'm told we need the microphone for the video.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. All right.
In your mind, how do these designs relate to neurodivergency? Looking at this from an outsider, and I know you didn't say anything about it, the colorful and lively nature, the I'll say disregard of traditional boundaries, and even the way that human beings interact with the architecture definitely reads as something that could be very translatable to those who are neurodivergent. And how does neurodivergency interact with your designs in your mind, as well as how do these designs fit in a world that is more neurotypical?
I love that question. And I need to just preface it by saying I'm not an expert on neurodivergency, but it is absolutely something we think about and consider, and frankly, something that I hope will be a more explicit and intentional part of the future work. But I do think that maybe on like a general level, like neurodivergence often has to do with the variety and diverse ways that we engage with our senses in the world. It's very often a sensorial question. And there's, lots of different extremes in terms of overstimulation, understimulation, but also just a variety of neurological intelligences about how we perceive and understand the environment around us. And so, at least on a high level, I think it's incumbent upon us, and something we strive for in our work, to create multiple entry points in a given project that may focus on that may put more or less weight on different parts of the senses. Whether it's something that's more tactile, whether it's something that's more about being in a more tight or enclosed space versus being in an expansive one. That there's options, that there's entry points, and that we consider as much as we can the full gradation of senses of engagement and ultimately of emotions and responses of how we see, perceive, and understand the world, which I think is what one of architecture's superpowers is. So I realize that's not a very specific answer, that's a general answer, and I think your question deserves a more specific answer. But that's how I think about it.
So, as an architect and someone who works in the Chicago area for quite some time, there's a lot of romanticism for those kind of old-fashioned, ornate details that many of the buildings in the area have. Stuff on the brownstones, the pillars, the leaves, all that jazz. So I was just wondering what your opinion is about that more ornate traditional architecture that may or may not see a return here if we ever get around to making them into essentially in factories as a bunch of puzzle pieces, as it was back in the day when you could just take some ornate ceiling tile or fancy cherub statue and put it right on the wall.
Let me make sure, is your question, how do I feel about ornaments and ornate details? I'm not sure I totally understand your question.
I'm not sure if I totally understand it either. I was just I need some sleep. Anyway, I'm asking what's your opinion of more that kind of architecture in particular?
I mean, I think, so thank you for your question. I mean, for me, I am really interested in the relationship between character and architecture, which is a subject in architectural history that has a long lineage and that we go into in this book, and that I'm interested in some parts and not others. And I think ornament and ornate details are one part of that larger story about what are the qualities of the built environment that both give it character and, for my purposes, also make it become a character, which are two slightly different things, albeit related. Like just like this idea of like buildings have character, or like what's the character of the neighborhood versus like a building as a character and a building as a protagonist of a story, a subject. And those are two different, but they have some slippery connections. And so, again, I'm not totally sure what you're asking, but I think I enjoy and indulge in the quirks of buildings because I see that as analogous and entry points into the quirks and character traits and personality attributes of any kind of being. So I care about that stuff. Again, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, but I think it matters.
He kind of seemed to lean towards this colorful modernist take on architecture. I was just wondering what you thought about more traditional stuff, since it also is in the same vein of adding a lot more character to buildings, while also being very much a more traditional part of your practice.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. Yeah, I mean, the projects I've showed have a particular aesthetic affinity and have particular qualities that some might trace to postmodernism, some might trace to other things. I'm less interested in style. I mean, I acknowledge that like my work, our work has like, we have certain aesthetic affinities that we're interested in, and I don't see as like my sort of creative task to replicate or recreate, let's say, a specific ornament or stylistic tradition. At the same time, there's like aesthetic affinities that are just like intuitive and that are part of the practice, and that sometimes I think can be, sometimes maybe as a distraction, but I think more often is, I think, an attempt to break with, or not break with so much as to create a contrast with oftentimes a more historical context in which we're operating. And I realize the Mies van der example isn't the maybe historic ornate detail that you're talking about, but I think that's a good example in the sense that we're trying to contrast an aesthetic that we're finding in order to create a new story and to order to create a new mode of participation into something that exists. And that requires, in some case, maybe an over-exaggeration of contrast, or like perhaps a critique might be an overindulgence in color and shapely qualities. But for us, it's been, I think it's been impactful in the work we've done so far in the ways that it's drawn new audiences to it. But that's maybe a separate question than like interrogating the deeper aesthetics of what we're doing and the politics of those aesthetics, which is maybe another conversation.
We have time for maybe one more quick question. If there is one.
I was just gonna ask, like, how does the construction go? Like, what does that look like? Do you do it yourself? I saw some photos of like people, it looked like in a community, like painting. So I just wanted to know how hands-on it was.
Great question. I mean, in general, most of the projects I showed today, I did not build. When I first started my practice, I built all of the projects. I think the only project I showed today that I personally built was this one. This guy. I built this one. But most of the projects that I showed, I did not build, mostly because I don't have the setup. I actually really like building, but I'm very inefficient at it, and I don't have the right setup. And so we work with fabricators, we work with builders. And I mean, one of the joys of running my practice is just building relationships with builders and fabricators with whom, oftentimes builders and fabricators that have an architectural background, and that we have, at this point, built such a strong relationship that we can actually create a minimum number of drawings in order to get the thing we want built, because we've worked together so many times. We like know we know each other's capacities and affinities, and it's a way for us actually to do projects, especially with nonprofit partners and community partners that have smaller budgets, because it allows us to make fewer drawings, which would be the part of our professional design services that is expensive labor-wise. So we make less drawings because we've built these relationships with fabricators that can build our visions with less details. But for the most part, with the exception of this one, all the projects I showed were built by others.
Well, thank you for this lecture and discussion. Please join me in thanking Joseph one more time.